Alright, today I'm doing another one of those video essays that I do from time to time, or at least I'm calling this one a video essay. It's really more like an open call to discussion, I guess, technically speaking. Like, this is a thing that I want to get you guys thinking about and talking about, whether in my own comment section or somewhere else, though preferably the former, because that equals engagement on my video, and that's a good thing, for me, anyway. Today we're going to be talking about lore movies. Like, I don't know if that's actually a term that people use for them, but it's a term that I've been using for them ever since I saw a Quentin Reviews video where he used the term. Basically, a lore movie is a movie, a standalone, feature-length feature that relies on outside lore from other projects, whether within its own franchise or otherwise, to tell its story, and therefore it's not self-contained, and, like, not in the way that, like, sequels aren't self-contained. Because, like, we've kind of universally agreed that there's a certain amount of lore from other stuff that can make it into a movie before it becomes convoluted and messy. And some sequels don't even manage to pull that off. Like, some sequels are so overblown because they rely so much on previous lore or setting up lore for future projects that it hurts the film as a standalone project. I'm going to be pulling a lot from the MCU today, so my example for something like this would probably be something like Iron Man 2. And I say Iron Man 2 because Iron Man 2 was a sequel to just one movie. There were other movies happening at around the same time, aside from Iron Man 1, that existed in the same universe. But this was a sequel to just that one movie. And while it might be enjoyable to someone who's invested in this world already, or who already likes Iron Man as a character and is enjoying this specific interpretation of him, it was hard for general audiences to get into that film because it didn't really seem to set up much or pay off much of its own story. It seemed more preoccupied with dropping references to the other MCU films that were coming out at around the same time and setting up for future MCU projects. And while I admit that I fall into that former camp of people who can enjoy the movie because I'm invested enough in the lore already, I can understand why people had an issue with it. Spending that much time focusing on lore that comes from outside of this one specific film meant reduced time to develop the villains. For example, like Whiplash, the main villain of the movie, or at least the main physical threat of the movie. I'd actually argue that Hammer is the main villain, but that's beside the point. Like, he's only as interesting as he is because he's portrayed well. There's not much meat to him in terms of his characterization. As a standalone film, Iron Man 2 is really only saved by its performances and by its visuals, which still hold up really well even today. Not as well as modern MCU stuff, but still really well. And before I go on to talking about more stuff in this similar vein, I want to talk about another movie that has kind of a similar vibe to it. A movie which, while I find it entirely enjoyable on its own because I'm already a fan of at least the majority of the lore that went into creating it, I don't think it's objectively a great movie on its own. And I hate saying that so much because the movie I want to talk about next, and this was actually talked about in that Quentin Reviews video that I mentioned as well, Linkara's Atop the Fourth Wall of the movie. Now, I'm a huge fan of Linkara, and I want to apologize for saying that his movie isn't good, because I really respect the guy and I look up to him as a creator. And I specifically got into watching his review show because of the lore. I had seen it a couple of times, and it was fine. I enjoyed it. I like comics, and I like building my knowledge base on comics without having to read swaths and swaths of comics myself in a short period of time. But I only started watching his show sequentially because I stumbled upon the TV tropes page for it. And I'm like, oh, this show has lore. That's pretty cool. I imagine it's going to be kind of campy because he's this independent online critic guy, but it could be a lot of fun to watch. And I watched it, and I love it. I think the lore that he puts into his videos is really cool. His effects aren't amazing, the acting's not perfect, but he seems to have a lot to say, and he seems to have so much fun doing it. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy the movie so much. It feels like a bunch of friends getting together and playing make-believe. And that's cool. I find it enjoyable for that reason. But because at the time, Linkara Lewis Can I call you Lewis? Lewis, are you here, Lewis? Are you watching this? Can I call you Lewis? I'll just stick with Linkara for now. Linkara at the time was part of the Channel Awesome group, or that guy with the glasses, or whatever they were called at the time. I don't frickin' know. And the Channel Awesome guys, they had their own movies with their own interconnected stories and lore. To a point, anyway. You had a lot of reviewers working with Channel Awesome who all followed this similar kind of formula with reviews stacked in between lore segments, story segments, where a world was built portraying the lives of online critics as ones wrought with sci-fi and fantasy danger. Problem was, those Channel Awesome movies are bad. Some of them are fun bad. But the later ones, the ones that actually had a substantial amount of lore to them, were just terrible. And I feel bad saying that because there are people I like involved in them. People I like even now. So not like the nostalgia critic. But they're just bad movies. And unfortunately, one of the things that Linkara does, that I actually respect a lot but think is a bad idea, is, not so much anymore, but back then especially, he used to make it very clear that his show didn't just exist in that shared continuity with those other shows for those crossover movies, but it existed in the same continuity as those other shows all the time. And so when he went to go make his movie, I guess he felt obligated to pull from the lore of those other projects. And it really drags the movie down, even more so than it just being bogged down in his own lore would have. And the way I see it, this actually compares pretty well to Iron Man 2. The Linkara lore is the Iron Man lore, and the Channel Awesome lore is the expanded MCU universe lore. And because there's so much of both of those things there, it takes away time that the characters could have had to grow and develop and tell their own stories. And one of the reasons I like Atop the Fourth Wall, the movie, as much as I do, as a fan, is because in spite of that, the writing still does a good job of giving us a little bit of each of these characters anyway. That said, though, Linkara's movie was not made for anybody but his fans, and by extension, fans of Channel Awesome. So it's excusable that his movie is presented the way it is. I kind of wish it wasn't, because back when it was... Probably not when it was announced. When I found out about it, I guess, because I think it came out before I started watching the show regularly. I can't remember. That's beside the point. Back when I found out about it, whenever that was, I had some friends I wanted to try to get into his show. Friends who are fans of nerdy media like I am. And I was hoping the movie would be a good jumping on point for them. And it isn't really, unfortunately. It's fine. I think it's a solid movie for fans. But it's only really a solid movie for fans. And yet, I think his movie is perfectly fine. I don't think there's any problem with it whatsoever. It is what it is, and I think it does a perfectly good job of succeeding at what it is. I am stammering so much because I'm worried he's going to watch this and hate me. I think he's younger than me too, which is particularly embarrassing. But meanwhile, I don't really think Iron Man 2 is a good movie, and I don't really think, despite the fact that I do enjoy it well enough, I don't think it's really excusable that it exists in the form that it does. And a lot of people agree with me on that. In fact, a lot of people have kind of conflated that to the entirety of the MCU, which is not something I disagree with, but that's going to be the main thesis of this video. I do think it's possible to do lore movies well. Even lore movies that have as much interconnectivity as Iron Man 2. It's just, Iron Man 2 was kind of a prototype of that, and was therefore a flawed early example. In fact, for a long time, essentially, since the moment we realized that we might get more MCU shows on Disney+, I have wanted the MCU to move to more of a comic booky kind of format, with the Disney Plus shows representing the ongoing series, focusing on individual characters or pairs of characters or small groups of characters and developing them, rather than us getting origin movies and then sequels to origin movies. While the movies themselves took the form of event comics, for lack of a better term. Bigger, more impactful events where more characters might come together and cross over in ways that they wouldn't in one of their individual stories. More like an Avengers, Or like, for example, a Spider-Man story, where Spider-Man not only crosses over with the Sorcerer Supreme, or at least the guy that was the Sorcerer Supreme at one point, and other versions of himself. And say what you want about Disney Plus, I have my criticisms of Disney and of Disney Plus as well. I have my criticisms of the MCU, too. You can be a fan of something and still be critical of it. But say what you want about Disney Plus, that's basically the model that they have moved to. In fact, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, I'm pretty sure the next MCU movie, I don't think there's one before that I'm forgetting. It doesn't really matter. But the second Doctor Strange movie, it's not a Doctor Strange 2. It's going to focus on Doctor Strange. He's going to be the main character who drives the plot forward. But it definitely feels like they're treating this movie like a big event comic. And yet, based on all of the promotional material I've seen, it feels like even though it's going to have connective tissue with some of the Disney Plus series, you're not going to have needed to see them in order to enjoy this movie. It'll just be that if you have seen them, you'll get a little bit more out of some of the references than you would otherwise. And to go back to the comic book analogy, it's more of an event comic that doesn't require you to read the tie-ins, but you can to get more out of the story. And yet, I would still be skeptical that it was going to be such a thing, except that that's exactly what Spider-Man No Way Home was. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, this video is a little petty. I decided to make this video in this form rather than just reviewing Spider-Man No Way Home, because I saw an article, I can't remember the exact title, but it was something along the lines of like the 19 MCU and other movies that you need to see to understand Spider-Man No Way Home. And I had already seen the movie when I saw this headline, and so I knew it was crap. And it made me mad, because people were sharing it around to disparage this movie that I think is a very, very good movie. Like, I like Spider-Man as a character in general, but like, Spider-Man 2, I think we can all agree that's probably the best of them, objectively. I won't say this one was better, but I think No Way Home was the best one since then, by a pretty wide margin. And this is coming from someone who liked both of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, at least to a degree, and has enjoyed both of the other MCU Spider-Man movies. Now, fair warning, there are going to be spoilers for No Way Home in this video. I'm kind of going to speak to you as if you've seen the movie, so, you know, see the movie. I don't particularly care how. Wink. A very brief summary of it. It's basically exactly what everybody expected it to be based on the rumors. Some terrible stuff has been happening to MCU Peter recently. The entire world has found out his identity. There are people who still trust him and people who don't. It's rough on him, but he cares more about his friends even than himself. So he tries to get Doctor Strange to make everybody forget that he's Spider-Man, but it goes awry, and some of his villains start coming through from other universes in the MCU multiverse, followed by other versions of himself, specifically Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. The three of them have some pathos. Aunt May is killed, unfortunately, in front of Peter, causing him to go through some understandably terrible stuff, but the other two kind of drag him back from it, help inspire him by referencing their own experiences, and then the three of them take on the combined forces of Peter's enemies and help them, rather than destroying them, as had been a pattern in the pre-MCU Spider-Man movies. And in the end, this is the major spoiler, because I don't remember any rumors that talked about this being a possibility, whereas the rest of those things I had at least seen obscure rumors that they might happen. At the end, everything's kind of reset, because the entire world forgets who Peter Parker even is. He basically has to start building his life over again. It was sort of a pseudo-adaptation of the Spider-Man One More Day story, except that it wasn't absolute shit, and he did lose an aspect of his life for entirely valid reasons. His sacrifice made sense. And I think the greatest thing about this movie, and admittedly, I'm sentimental toward those other past Spider-Man movies. I really enjoyed them, all of them to some degree, all 5 of the pre-MCU Spider-Man movies. I enjoyed them to some degree. That's my dog that I'm dog sitting, making all that noise in the background, in case you guys are wondering. Hi, buddy. You guys won't be able to see him because where the camera is, but this is This is Rocky you're hearing. He's a boxer, and I love him. But while I do feel sentimental towards those movies, and maybe that is clouding my judgment here, maybe I do have a certain amount of bias, but I can't think of anything in this movie that you absolutely need to have seen those movies to understand. This is, at its core, a very strong movie with very strong performances from some very strong younger actors, telling a story of loss and hardship and doing right, when it would be easier to just do the easy thing. The pathos feels real despite the fact that this world is fantastical, filled with fantastical people and fantastical technologies. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of the Peter-MJ relationship in the MCU movies compared to some of the Peter romances in the previous series, Tom Holland and Zendaya do a good enough job of selling this relationship and showing how much these two characters mean to each other that I totally buy Peter's motivations in this film. When the other villains are brought in, they explain their backstories well enough and they play their characters well enough. The actors play their characters well enough. You can understand where these characters are coming from without knowing anything about them going into this. And the other versions of Peter, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker and Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker, even ignoring the fact that people just know something about these versions of the characters, that knowledge has kind of seeped into the popular consciousness. There's a great scene introducing them and explaining how they're here, and when they finally do meet up with the new version of Peter and give their advice, they explain themselves well enough and concisely enough, and we see the emotional impact of the things they're talking about well enough on their faces, that you don't need to know who they are to know why they have the insight that this character requires to get his shit together. They're written well enough like they are this film's own characters. There's even a scene in this where Andrew Garfield's Peter manages to save Zendaya's MJ from a fall. The same kind of fall that killed his girlfriend Gwen Stacy. But because of some dialogue earlier that is brilliantly delivered, you understand why it's such a big deal and why he breaks down so much when he manages to save her. It's a powerful moment, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be a powerful big moment just in general, because the writing and the performances are that strong. But if you have seen The Amazing Spider-Man 2, weird web hand thing notwithstanding, then your reaction to that scene is going to be even stronger. It's going to be some tasty, rich icing slathered on top of an already moist and delicious cake. And while I do feel like maybe there are too many lore movies permeating our box offices at this point, maybe we should cut back a little bit, spread them out a little more, release-wise, I think this is a far better model. And if we could just stick to this, then I think the stigma against lore movies will go away. Because this is not a bad movie, despite being a lore movie by definition. So, yes, I do think lore movies, good mainstream blockbuster lore movies can be a thing, and I hope some other companies start following this model. Because you had, like, the DCEU, for example, is the big one, then things like the Universal Movie Monsters shared universe that tried to follow more the Iron Man 2 model, and they have failed. Like, the DCEU is only puttering along because it's DC. It's like the other big comic book guy, right? Recently, though, they've started to lean more towards focusing on more self-contained movies. And I hope they carry on with that and start to do something more akin to what the MCU is doing now and releasing supplementary material to focus on their DCEU characters elsewhere. Because the MCU, like it or not, is the pioneer in this kind of storytelling for the big screen. And now that they have found something that I think genuinely works for what they're trying to do, there are some other fictional universes that I would like to see brought to live action, and I think they could do that by following this formula. I'm not going to get into which ones are at the top of my list or anything, but there are a couple. I don't think we really need to invest our time in too many of them, but there are a couple of them, and I hope they work out. That said, at the end of the day, I want to know what you think of these concepts. What do you think of lore movies as I've defined them? Do you think they work? Do you think they don't work? Do you think even the modern iterations of them have too many problems? Do you dislike them on principle? I'm very curious to know where people stand with this. So as per usual, let's get a discussion going in the comments section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else who you think would enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out links to my various social medias as well as the many ways you can help out the channel. Those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.